I'm happy to kick it off. And Jeff, you have control of the slides. So I'll just, and Jeff and I are going to sort of split this up, but we thought it would be helpful for this conversation to first frame it by just giving you a sense of what the state agencies have been doing to plan for and prepare for the implementation of our 30 by 30 goals, let you know a little bit more about sort of our timelines and next steps and get some input. So I think that's really the intent of this presentation, and we'll go ahead and get started. So I think everybody is in this group is pretty familiar with 30 by 30 and the legislation and the concept, but in December of 2022, we passed legislation that calls on the state to contribute to the national effort to conserve at least 30% of our lands, inland waters, and ocean areas by 2030. So that's what we're all talking about here. Jeff, you want to flip to the next one? This is just a little bit about the history. I don't think we need to spend a huge amount of time on it, but to give you all a sense of sort of where the conversation came from. We've been talking about percentages when it comes to conservation goals internationally for many years. In 2010, at the UN Convention on Biodiversity, we started the conversation. We identified a first goal. At that point, it was 17% of the world's land by 2020. Then, through a series of conversations and research and study by a number of environmental groups, nationally and internationally, we came up with the concept of a 30 by 30 model, which has now been and is being adopted by a number of countries, states, international treaties. President Biden launched it as a national goal in 2021. And since then, and these numbers I think are slightly outdated at this point, so they're probably even higher. But we had in 2022, 200 countries sign on to 30 by 30. Then, as I mentioned, December 22, New York enacted its legislation. Today, this is where I think the numbers maybe even a little higher now. There are 15 states and growing that are participating in some way. All of those are different. Some are enacting legislation like we have and California did. Some are doing it through executive order. Some are doing it as goals that are identified by their various natural resource departments and divisions. So there are a number of ways that states are working toward these 30 by 30 goals. In our case, we identified it as a goal through legislation. Can we go to the next slide? This one we can come back to if it's helpful for conversation. We don't need to have a lot of time on it now, but this is just some snippets of our implementing legislation, our law, and the language in our environmental conservation law. And I think it's important. It identifies DEC and OPRHP, the Office of Parks and Recreation, as the sort of primary agencies that are focused on developing a set of strategies and methodologies to achieve the 30 by 30 goals. So since the law was passed, DEC and parks have been working really collaboratively to start planning for this. We've started bringing in other agencies as well, because although it's a DEC and parks sort of lead, we know that there are a lot of agencies who have an interest and input here. And so we are looking at all of those varying degrees of input, interest, consideration. And then this language just lays out some of the highlights of what the goals really are and why we are trying to achieve 30 by 30. So it's in order to achieve a series of conservation targets. It identifies wetlands, talks a lot about the importance of biodiversity restoration and connectivity, talks about equitable outdoor access, farmland, climate resilience, tribal partner input. So it gives us sort of a map of what we want to conserve, and what we are tasked with doing is really how to do that. And that's where that strategies and methodologies document comes in to play that I'll talk about in a second. So Jeff, can we go into the timeline? So we talked about some of this. Our next deadline is July 1, 2024. And I will say one of the things that I think is really important for all of us to understand is that the legislation calls on us to post for public comment the actual strategies and methodologies that we are going to employ to get to 30 by 30. I think it's really important that everybody know that our intent is not that on July 1, we are going to have a final document. On July 1, we will have what will be the beginning of a really thorough public input and public comment process. So we right now are in the process of developing draft materials, things to get your input on, but there will be very considerable opportunity for public input after we send out the draft strategy and methodology documents starting on July 1. And we really want that input. So, in other words, it's not like the time between now and July is anybody's bite at the apple. It's not as though if folks don't give us their thoughts on what should constitute 30 by 30, what should define 30 by 30, you're not going to have an opportunity for input. We really want this to be a decision that's based on input from everybody. And I think we also envision that it might be an adaptive set of definitions as we get closer to reaching our goals. So I'll just say that I think in the context of all of our collective goals, it's really important to keep that in mind. This is going to be the start of a public process, and it will be an ongoing public process. So, as I mentioned, if you just look at the rest of this slide, public comment period, we're going to have multiple meetings. We're still mapping out what those are going to look like and how we're going to hold them. We will have a pretty lengthy public comment period to make sure that everybody has time to really pull their comments and input together and to react to what you see when you get the strategies and methodologies document. And then in the fall, loosely, roughly, of 2024. We are going to update those. We are also simultaneously, I'm sure you're all aware, working on the update to the open space plan. So we're thinking about how the 30 by 30 goals are going to be incorporated within the open space plan. And that timing is somewhat aligned, somewhat disaligned, because I think the final open space plan will not be out by the fall of 2024. It'll take some more time. It'll be, Jeff can speak to this better than I, but 2025. So we're thinking about ways to incorporate them, but understanding that we're working on two slightly different timelines there. Then once we have final strategies and methodologies based on that public input process, through 2030, we are going to work on implementing, tracking, and I'll say, although I think at the end of this, we have the legislation sunsetting, my hope, and I would imagine everybody's hope here, is that the strategies and methodologies that we come up with that inform our goal for 2030 will actually be an effective tool to inform our conservation work beyond that and moving into the future. So although I see the legislation sunsetting, I don't see the usability of what we develop as sunsetting. So I think that's maybe another important point. Jeff, you want to go to the next one? And so I just outlined this. The July 1 is our next big deadline, draft methodologies, strategies document that'll give you all something to really react to and respond to. The most, I think, top of mind element of that will be actually defining what constitutes conserved for the purposes of meeting those goals. We've also spent a lot of time talking about how we're going to map whatever it is that we define as constituting conserved, both from the perspective of the baseline, what's already there, and a goals perspective and what we're getting. And so I think that's all going to be part of that draft strategies and methodologies document. We're working on a web page that way we can sort of keep updating the public as we learn more and get further along. Like I said, we're working on sort of exactly what the public comment period is going to look like, how many meetings will be held, where, how, all of that. And certainly there will also be an environmental news bulletin notice, sort of making everybody aware, and I suspect also a press release. So those are some of the things that we're working on right now to get to that July 1 deadline. Jeff, want to go to the next slide? And I think from here, Jeff's going to talk a little bit to give you some background on what we've been doing internally to get us to the point that we were ready to share a working draft document with you for review and input. So Jeff, you want to take over here and talk a little bit about our internal process to date?
Yeah. So we've been meeting for a while and part of our organizing, we put together some working groups to take care of specific portions of putting together the definition and mapping and everything. And so leading the effort is the executive prioritization and reporting group that the rest of the groups kind of work on things and then run them by the executive group. Mapping and tracking, of course, is going to be working on mapping where we are presently for a baseline and helping with tracking as we move forward with implementation to be able to communicate what's been happening. And some of that I'll go into in further detail on the next slide. The policy and related programs has been doing a lot of the work of assembling the strategies and the draft definition and coordinating that with all of the detail from the legislation, working into the open space plan update, and basically coordinating with a lot of different groups, reaching out to some stakeholders and talking with other state agencies that have a interest in this project. And then the stakeholder engagement and communication group is going to be working on further engaging stakeholders, helping with the public comment period. And then the funding and land acquisition group will come more into its element as we go into implementation and working on identifying funding sources, potential additional funding sources beyond the ones that we typically think of, like the Environmental Protection Fund and the Bond Act, to be able to leverage those funding sources. And of course, one of the components of the 30 by 30 strategies will be land acquisition. So working through how to expedite that progress on that front. So then I'll hop back to the mapping group. We're starting from where the New York Protected Areas database has already developed. This is a product that the New York Natural Heritage Program assembled, and it feeds into, there's a national protected areas database, and this feeds into that on a periodic basis. And basically this is mainly looking at lands that are conserved through fee acquisition, so full ownership or conservation easements. And it includes government holdings, state and municipal and federal, as well as non-governmental organizations, mainly land trusts that hold lands around the state, both in fee and in easement. And right now, NIPAD is about 6 million acres, which is about 19 to 20% of the land area of the state. And there's some work to continue to do. If you dig into it a bit, there are some areas that have not been included yet. Some of the land trust holdings have not made it in there yet. It's based on who has been working with the Natural Heritage Program, as well as who's been interested in sharing their data. Certainly, we encourage folks to reach out on the NIPAD webpage. It's nipad.org. There's a contact us link there, and you can email them, or there's an email form. And Nick Conrad, who's the lead on the project, would be happy to work with you on incorporating additional protected lands. I have noticed that there's some municipal lands which they went through and looked at some of the tax coding, and that doesn't always line up with the present use. Yes, Katie.
I was going to say, Jeff, just to add to everything you're saying, one, to reiterate that one of the things that will be really helpful for everybody here to do is just to refer to NIPAD and let us know if you see things missing from the conserved areas that it identifies. And also, Jeff said this, but this is not to suggest that the layers that exist there now are the limitations of what we think is going to qualify as conserved to get to 30 by 30. This is just what we have. So these are the layers that have already been developed, that already exist, that we can just make sure we're not missing any of. And then from there, whatever other whatever other lands or tools we identify as meeting the definition of conserved, we can turn into another layer in this database. So it's not to suggest that this is exhaustive, but this is an example of the type of mapping that we have to help us track and to use as a tool. And Jeff, do you know if this includes the ag and markets easements?
So I think some of them, yes. I know I've seen there's definitely some of the land trusts that have been involved with that program. There's definitely agricultural easements, and I forget the exact phrasing that they use, but if you are from an organization that holds those, go and take a look and make sure that we have them all. I can't say whether it has the full complement of the Farmland Protection Implementation Grant easements. And our mapping and tracking group, in addition to adding layers for the types of land that count, or types of programs that count towards conservation for 30 by 30, we'll be looking at adding some additional tools and functionalities to NIPAD to be able to help with tracking what progress has been made over time and be able to communicate that out to the public. And then, so after July 1st, I think Katie already covered the public comment and the public meetings part. We'll summarize those public comments and include a summary with the final document, and which we'll be publishing after we get a chance to review all the comments and make updates to that draft document. And then we'll also be incorporating those comments and the strategies where appropriate into the open space conservation plan, which we're anticipating a draft in early 2025, and then hopefully have that wrapped up by the end of 2025. And then we'll have the legislation requires an annual progress report and update be posted to the DEC webpage. Hopefully it will be a little more frequent than annual, assuming the functionality that I think will be part of NIPAD should allow us to do regular updates with that. So I think that's all for us at the moment. There's certainly, if there's additional input that you all have on 30 by 30 and where we're going to, you know, feel free to reach out to us through the open space email that comes to my desk. So I'll be there, and certainly if you have public comments, or feel free to attend the public meetings.
Katie and Jeff, thank you for giving us that high-level update. That's been really helpful.